Today's daf is daf Memches, and we're 4 lines down from the top where we left off. Omer of Yosef bar min Yomi, Omer of Nachman, Rea hasmucha ledofen ein choshen la. So today's daf is going to deal with the lungs that we started yesterday, and there are various situations that have to be dealt with, whether they're treifa or not treifa. You find a hole in the lung, you find a needle in the lung. There are adhesions in the lungs, which is called sircha. They're part of the lungs, which is called bronchial tubes. And then there's the tissue of the lungs. I mean, there are many, many different variations. This particular variation is the relationship between the lung and the wall of the chest cavity. And in the nature of the animal, if all things are well, the lung very often is connected to the chest cavity. And Rav Yosef points out that there's nothing to be concerned about, ein choshen law, because even though we find now some sort of an adhesion, which is a result of the puncture in the lung, which normally would make the animal treifa, but here, since the lung is adhering to the wall of the chest cavity, therefore, although this adhesion is a result of fluids that oozed out from the chest wall from the lung, and if we would have known that the source of the fluids was the lung, the animal would be treifa. But Rav Nachman says that we need not assume that there's a hole in the lung. We attribute that sircha, that adhesion, to an injury in the chest wall. And that injury healed. And as part of that process of healing the injury in the chest wall, the lung somehow adheres to the chest wall at that point, and the animal is considered kosher. Now, even though we have a principle called safek d'oraisa l'chumra, and we're not sure whether or not the oozing from the lung is a result of some puncture in the lung, or it's rather a hole or an injury in the chest wall, Rav Nachman holds that since this adhesion, this sircha, was produced by the lung, it doesn't indicate a vadai puncture. It's only a possible puncture. So we have near a svek. Why? One suffix is whether or not this was an injury to the chest or it was a puncture to the lungs. And a second suffix, afilim tim tzalomer, if I assume that the puncture was in the lungs, it still is possible that it's not a treifa, because that puncture may have healed as a result of the adhesion to the chest. So even if I assume that the fluids are coming from the lungs, that's only a possibility, a suffix, that the lung was nikev, was punctured. Because it's possible the lungs could generate adhesions even without being punctured. Now the Gemara continues and says, Helsa tzmachim choshen la. But if there are blisters on the lungs, in other words, there's that adhesion and now there are blisters, then choshen la. Then we really have to take into consideration a significant probability that the adhesion results from and was caused by a puncture in the lung. So this is all the opinion of Rav Yosef, and now we get to the opinion of Mar Yehuda Mishmei Davimi Omar, Echad Zeh v'Echad Zeh Choshen Lo. In other words, we cannot be Mekil here and be Machshir in the case of Rea Hasmucha L'Dofen, but rather we have to be Choshesh. In other words, I don't care about the Hela Tzmachim. Even if there are no blisters on the lungs, nevertheless, we have to consider the possibility that this adhesion, this sircha, is a result of a puncture in the lungs. So whereas Rav Yosef applied the principle of Sfek Sveka, no, I'm sorry. Sfek Sveka was in the case of Helsa. I'm sorry. We're good. Forget about Helsa Tzmachim. So in the regular case of Reas Smucha Ladofin, the original case, Rav Yosef was Mekil because of Sfek Sveka. Mar Yehuda was not willing to accept that Sfek Sveka. And he said this in the name of Avimi, who holds that if the sircha originated on the lung, then it is vadai that the lung was punctured, not the way we said it before, that maybe the lungs generated adhesions and sirchas without being punctured. According to Rav Avimi, the sircha in the lung is a vadai that the lung was nikev, was punctured. And therefore we only have one suffix. Did the sircha originate in the lung or in the chest wall? And in the case of one suffix, we say suffix d'oraisa l'chumra. Hechi avdinon. In other words, what exactly can we do, as a test, as an examination in all these cases when we are worried about the possibility that the adhesion was caused by an injury to the lung? Is there any way of investigating it? Now, the Gemara is going to offer the following suggestion. Omar Ravin Bar Shaba Asprali. I got the information here from Ravin as to how we can investigate this situation in order to determine whether the sircha was caused by an injury to the lung. Ma'isinin sakina de cholish puma. We have a sharp knife, umefarkinin la, and we slice through the sircha, through the adhesion, and now we separate the adhesion from the lung. And now we take a look at the areas, and we want to now, after we cut it out, ascertain the source of the adhesion. And how will we ascertain the source of adhesion, whether it's because of a puncture in the chest or chest wall or a puncture in the lung? If we look now, after having cut out the connection between the lung and the chest wall, we see that at this site, right where the adhesion was, there's a defect in the chest wall. Then we assume that the sircha was a result of the injury to the chest wall, and therefore it's not a treifa. But ve'i lo machmas reyahu. But if we look at the chest wall and we see that there's no defect in the chest wall, then by process of elimination, we have to assume that the sircha results from the injury to the lung, which is either vadai according to Rav Ami, or it's a suffix according to Rav Yosef. Utreifa, therefore the animal has to be assumed to be a treifa, and therefore the other test, which we normally do to see if there are air bubbles coming up, afagav the loka mafik zeka, even though we saw no bubbles coming up, there are no air bubbles, which means that the lung is airtight, and that's why the air is not able to escape from the lungs. Nevertheless, it still remains treifa because we know that there was an injury here that caused the sircha either in the chest wall or in the lungs. And since we found no defect in the chest wall, then by process of elimination, we have no choice but to assume that the injury was a result, that the injury took place in the lungs. However, the Gemara now presents another shita of Nechemia Bereder of Yosef, Badik Lebe Pshore. He used the old system of examination of the lungs, in which he put the lungs into a basin of water. Again, we said many times the water has to be lukewarm, and he would immerse it and look for signs of a puncture. Now, there's a lot of commentary here. Anyway, I thought that Rav Nechemia was being makil. Rashi, on the other hand, says that Rabbi Nechemia is being machmir. It wasn't enough for Rav Nechemia to say, let's look at the chest wall after we did this incision with a sharp knife and determine that there's no injury in the chest wall. That's not enough to be machshir the animal. But even upon finding that the chest wall was injured, in which case we said that the animal should be kosher because now we can attribute the adhesion to the injury to the chest wall rather than to the Rhea itself. He would test the lungs for a sign of a leak. In other words, we have here what's called in the Gemara's language a reusa. Reusa means we have already room to be suspicious, and therefore we have to undergo a second test and immerse the inflated lung into a bowl of lukewarm water, which we learned back on the Gemara earlier. Now, this is Rab Nechemia. Omar le Marzucha Breder of Huna Breder of Popular Avino. Now, it's very interesting here that we're talking about Ravina. I mean, this is an earlier generation of Amoraim. Ravina was the last of the Amoraim, when they finally sealed the Talmud. So apparently they're different Ravinas. But anyway, Hadar of Nechemia Breder of Yosef Atun. Ahamas Nisale, you, Atun, had the tradition of Rab Nechemia's statement about immersing it in lukewarm water, meaning even though you found an injury and you determined that there was an injury to the chest wall. But Anan, we had the statement of Rav Nechemia in a different context whatsoever. Our tradition is that not the way you have it, that the reference is to the case of the lung that's adhered to the chest wall, but rather, Adarava Masnisan law. The comment of Rav Nechemia was attached as an interpretation of Rava's statement, Yom Rava Hani, and this is the Rava that we had yesterday, Hani Tarti Uni, right? The uni are the lobes of the lung, and there are two lobes, the rea of the lung, disrichen lahadodi. Right? We said yesterday that according to Rava, you could be matir the animal if you have lobes of the lung that are adhering one to the other. And lesle b'dikusalach shure. Normally, we would examine the lungs through that examination with the water to make sure that the lungs are airtight and there's no puncture in the lungs. But in this particular case, said Rava, since the lobes are adhering to each other, you cannot be matir and assume that the animal is kosher through the normal examination that determines that the lungs are airtight. And we automatically, says Rava, have to be machmir and assume that it's treifa. And here's where we have Rab Nechemia's attached comment that Rab Nechemia berei de Rav Yosef bodek b'pshorei. Notice Rab Nechemia argues with Rava, not about the case of a lung that was adhering to the chest wall, but rather in this case where you have two lobes of the lungs that are adhering to each other. And here he said that the regular classic examination of guaranteeing that the lungs are airtight would suffice if there's no bubbles coming up to convince us with solid, reliable evidence that there was no puncture to the lungs, and therefore the animal is kosher. So that's the second version of Rav Nechemia that's offered by Mar Zutra. And Rav Ashi is going to attack this second version of Nachman. Hi, my. Why are you making this assumption? Bishlei in the case of the lungs that was adhering to the chest wall, talinan bidofen ukshera. We find the sircha attributable to the injury to the chest wall after we did that examination with the knife, and therefore we declare the animal as being kosher. Aval hasam, but in the case of where there was an adhering of the two lobes of the lung, hasam ihai nikiv treifa, v'ihai nikiv treifa. It matters not to which lung, or to which lobe, I should say, of the lung, you attribute this sircha. It matters not. If you attribute it to this particular lobe, then it's treifa. If you attribute it to this lobe, it's treifa. It's not like the case of the chest wall, where if you say the injury was a result of the chest wall, then it's not an injury to the lung itself. So therefore, in the case where no matter which lobe was the source of the sircha, and in any event it's treifa, then testing the lung by putting it into water and determining that it's airtight doesn't accomplish anything. And therefore, Rav Ashi rejects completely the second version, that of Mar Zutra, of Rav Nechemia. Umi Omar of Nachman Hachi. Now the Gemara is questioning the basic psak of Rav Nachman, that if the lung adheres to the chest and it blistered, therefore we have to consider that maybe the lung was punctured, then the animal should be treifa. V'omar of Yosef Parmi Omar of Nachman, Rea shenikva v'dofen sasmita kshera. The lung was punctured, and now the chest wall seals the puncture. So now we're entering Rabosai into this entire section of Hilchas Treifos where there was a treifa, there was a puncture, but then it was healed, it was sealed. So when Rav Nachman holds that Reya Shednikva V'dofen, etc., Kshera, meaning the hole is sealed by the chest wall. So then let's go back to the original version or statement or ruling of Rav Nachman, to the effect that if there's an adhesion of the lung to the chest wall, then we are suspicious that maybe there was a puncture to the lung and therefore the animal's treifa. Who cares? Even if there were, and I assume, a hole in the lung, nevertheless, Rav Nachman is quoted as saying that dofen sosasma. Sosasma means it plugs it up. So if the chest wall plugs up the hole in the lung, the animal should be kosher. So how can you tell me that Rav Nachman himself said that if you have a situation of a puncture in the lung, when the lung is adhering to the chest wall, that it's treif? Why would it be treif? The hole itself in the lung is sealed up, and that's called sosma, by the chest wall. Lokash. It all depends on where you find the puncture. Okay, let's see if we can get by this one. Hasam, when did Rav Nachman come to be Mekil? And he was machshir because he said that the dofen sosma, that the chest wall is considered a plug up. That's a case where again, now we're trying to identify exactly the location where the lung was adhering to the chest wall in the place of growth. Okay, so now, Rav Osai, I don't know exactly what place of growth means, but I can tell you this: it means it's the natural location. That's teva. That's the way the animal should be, and it lies. The lung lies flush against the chest wall. Now, exactly where that is, I do not know. But since it's natural, there are no forces that tend to pull the lung and the chest wall apart. That would therefore prevent the chest wall from plugging up the puncture in the lung. But hacha, when we had the original transmission of Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman was machmir, and he determined the animal's treifa because the chest wall is not same. It's not an effective plug up. That was shalom b'makom revisa. The puncture was in that part of the lung. Again, we have to locate where the puncture is on the lung, and that part of the lung that's not naturally flush against the chest wall. And in such a case, the assumption is that the lung will therefore tend to pull away from the chest wall because that's not the natural place where the lung lies flush against the chest wall, and therefore the seal is not going to be effective, and the puncture will remain an open puncture. Now the Gemara asks our question. So, Heichan Mokum Revisa, where is the natural place where the chest wall and the lung, where the lung is naturally flush against the chest wall? Chituche diune. Okay, now we get back to the lobes of the lung. So there's one place where we have to locate it. Again, we had this in the past, where chituche deune. Chituche means when you slice something in order to cut it apart. So that's where, let's just review. There are 3 lobes of the right lung. There are 2 lobes of the left lung. And apparently, Makom Rivusa is a place where those 2 sets of lobes separate each other, the left from the right. So the upper portion of the lung lies in the narrow forward part of the chest near the neck, and therefore remains at all times naturally flushed against the chest wall. Gufa, let's go back to the statement of Rav Yosef Bar Yomi in the name of Rav Nachman. That we could be makil if the chest wall clogs up the hole, the nekev. In the rea, again, it has to be only in a makom revisa. Omar avin of a hudis savich. This is another condition that has to be fulfilled in order to be makil. And that is savich. Savich is translated here as enmeshed. Enmeshed means that it's not just touching it, but it's sort of like enclosed in the basar. And the place where you found the hole in the rea is enmeshed with the meat, the basar that's between the ribs. And we have to emphasize that it's not stuck to the ribs themselves. And all this is Ravina. Amalei Rav Yosef Ravina. Again, this is an earlier Ravina. The lo savich my treifa. What are you telling me? If the place where there's a hole in the lung is not enmeshed with the meat between the ribs, it's treifa. Alma mrina nekuva he. You're telling me it's treif. Why? Because if the hole is not enmeshed with the meat between the ribs, it's treifa, because we assume that the puncture occurred again before it was enmeshed with the chest wall. Ihachi ki savich nami. You should be consistent. Then even if subsequently it becomes enmeshed in the chest wall, it should be deemed treifa. Tanya. And now we get a brisa that deals with what's called krus shivcha, which essentially has nothing to do with trephis, but the Gemara is going to make that analogy. And the Gemara is going to try to prove that everything depends upon whether or not you can take this injury and it can return to its original natural normal state. So what's the case? Nikav. Now, if in the male organ there was a puncture, and now he becomes a krus shivcha because he can no longer have children because the sperm will not go in that direction, is possible. So he can't marry a normal Jewish girl. Maybe he can marry Gioris, but mipnei shu shoses, because now the sperm will just dribble out. But nistam, if that hole in his organ becomes plugged up, kosher, because now mipnei shu molid, he can now father children. And that's called a psul shechozer lechshero. So far at this point, it would seem that the Gemara is bringing a proof that you can have a nekev, and if it's flushed, if the lungs is flushed against the chest wall, we can now be machshir. But no, the Gemara is going to prove the opposite conclusion. Why? Because if we read this brisa carefully, it says vizeu. And the word vizeu is kind of like ze'aklal, right? What we had many times, ze'aklal l'me'utei mai. So zeu is coming to be mamayit. L'me'utei mai. It's very interesting. You have a brisa that deals with the subject of krus shivcha, and the brisa now adds a word to tell you that halach that we're formulating in krus shivcha, where it could be choser lechshero, doesn't apply l'me'utei, a case in trephis, with regard to the kashrus of the meat of a trefa. Lav l'me'utei ki ha'gavna. Isn't it coming to exclude the case where the lung was punctured, and then you're telling me, well, it was enmeshed subsequently in the chest wall and it becomes kosher? No, the Bryce is teaching us that once it's disqualified, once it is considered a treifa, then it's always a treifa. It cannot return to a state of kashrus. So even though you sealed up the hole because it was enmeshed in the chest wall, it's still treifa. And this is a kash on Ravina, because Ravina said that the punctured lung is only a treifa until it becomes enmeshed in the chest wall, in which case we reverse the status of the treifa and it becomes kosher. But the zeu is coming lemute. So Ravina responds, lo, that's not what the zeu is coming lemute. Lemute krum sha'ola machmas maka bereya, diena krum. The chumrah that we're going to derive from the miyud of zeu is in the case of a krum. Krum means a scab, and the scab was a result of a wound or a puncture in the lungs, and now the scab comes to clog up that puncture and ate a krum. It's not considered a scab, meaning it's not an effective seal. The animal remains treifa. But in a case where the area surrounding the hole becomes enmeshed with the wall, the meat of the wall of the chest, the animal becomes kosher. So don't make equations between krum and enmeshed in the meat of the chest. And Rabbi say this is all a result of the fact that in Hilchos Treifos we can't make analogies. Every case is slightly different and dealt with differently. Maskif law, mar ukva bar chama. Right? So again, Rav Nachman is quoted as saying that the chest, the wall, the chest wall can be a sosem. It can be machshir a treifa, even if there was a puncture in the lung and it's sealed up, closed up. But Ilu inkiv bidofen lehada my trefa. Now we talk about the following case. What happens if there's a puncture in the chest wall itself? And that puncture is located opposite the puncture in the lung. So again, in the physics of it, the air escapes from the lung through the punctured chest wall. The animal is treifa. So now Rav Ukva has a problem, because now you're telling me that a puncture in the chest wall makes the animal treifa. But our Mishnah says that a puncture in the lungs makes the animal treifa. Listening to Kuvas Hadofen, right now, Mishnah gives an exhaustive list of all the treifas. Why didn't the Mishnah include Nekuvas Hadofen? Meaning that if there's a puncture in the chest wall, that renders the animal treifa. So now the Gemara is going to slug up our Ukva by saying that with regard to the Kaved, we don't find in the Mishnah Nekuvas HaKaved. Why is that? You should be consistent. L'taimech, according to your reasoning, Chad Yomer of Yisrael Mara shenikfa v'kaved sosma kshera. Right, you have a puncture in the mara, the gallbladder, and now it's stima. It was sealed by what? By the liver, right? Because the liver is flush against that puncture in the gallbladder, which I think because the liver is right below the gallbladder, and the animal's kosher. So why don't you tell me that ilu nika inkiv kavid lahada my treifa? Let's say the liver itself had a puncture, right? We were talking about a puncture in the mara, in the gallbladder. And we were saying that it could be sealed by the liver. What happens if the liver itself became punctured, right? Opposite the puncture of the mara. So he adds here a comment that the bile now escapes from the gallbladder through the punctured liver. The animal's treifa is listening, according to your opinion. It should have said in the Mishnah, Nekuvas HaKaved. But again, Rabbosai, keep in mind, there is no psul of Nekuvas HaKaved. There's only a psul of Nekuvas HaKaved as a result of the fact that there's a nekev in the mara. And therefore, the principle as to whether or not it's included in the list of the Mishnah or not is elaki nikfa delav mina metarfa loktani. The Mishnah is not interested in cases where it becomes a treifa, not because of its own puncture, but because of another organ that's punctured. It's kind of like indirect. Is if that be the case, hachinami, now we can answer your question about Rav Nachman in the case where you found a puncture in the chest. Is keva delav mina mitarfa is there for the Mishnah Loktoni, leaves it out because it's not the puncture in the chest wall that makes the animal treifa, but rather it's the puncture in the lungs. Boy minei Rabba Bar Bar Chana Mishmuel Helsa Tzmachim Mahu. Now the lungs have blisters. It developed pus-filled swellings on the lung. Now, pus, I'm not sure if pus in a blister, I think, might be a result of a puncture, but maybe not. Omalek Shera. He says it's kosher. Omalek Afanan Afadi Omer Kain El Shetalmidim Mizdanzin. Now, the word Mizdanzin means they vacillate back and forth by davar. And the reason why they were not sure that the animal should be kosher in the case of these lung blisters is the Omer of Masna, because of a tradition in the name of Masna, that it all depends what's inside the blister. Let's puncture the blister, open it up. Malya Mugla, if we open up the blister to find it's full of pus, then that means there was a puncture, and therefore it's treif. But mayim zakim kshera. I don't know. I never punctured a blister, found clear liquid water in my blister. I don't know. Amalei, so Shmuel said to him, Ahi bechulya itmar. What Rav Masna said was not referring to a rea, but rather to a kulya. Kulya is the kidney. Okay, so once again, mali hocha, mali hosa. What difference whether it's a blister in a kidney or a blister in the lungs? I think that test of water versus pus should be anyway. And so now we're talking about blisters. That's the subject now of the daf. Right? All the lungs that were on the table there in the butcher's market were all full of blisters. Amalei. So now Rabbi Yitzchak is trying to get a psak from Bibirmi about blisters on lungs, and he says to him, "Lo boy mar so why don't you buy some of the meat and we'll have a mangal?" Amalei, Leslie Priti, I have no money in my pocket. Amalei, don't worry about that. Akfon, I have credit here with the butchers, and I'll buy it for you. Amalei ma evid l'cha. What should I do for you? In truth, I might be inclined to be mekil and be machsh, but chi'asu lekame de Rabbi Yochanan, these blisters on the lungs came in front of Rabbi Yochanan. Meshadu le lekame de Rabbi Yehuda. He didn't want to pass it on it to be mekil, but rather he would send it to Rabbi Yehuda, Berei Rabbi Shimon, who was apparently the expert here, and de Morile, but he had a tradition. Mishmei de Rav Lazar Berab Shimon lehetera. But the truth is that less lay low spherally. Meaning, I myself, says Rabbi Yochanan, I have hesitations here. I don't know. It seems to me that these blisters are indicative of punctures in the lungs. But you know what? Why don't you send it to Rabbi Yehuda and you'll get a kula? Very fascinating system of halacha, that sometimes you yourself think it's asur, so you don't want to tell the guy who's asking you that it's asur, so you send him to somebody who is mekil, who has what they call breiter plates, if you know what that phrase. Omar Rava, another story. Kiavi Masginan Basri Rav Nachman v'Shuka. They went after Rav Nachman in the shuk to Gildai. And Gildai are the tanners. So we're in the tanners marketplace. That special marketplace for the tanners. It reminds me of the Lower East Side of Manhattan in those days.